Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about the cost of the coronavirus pandemic, the lockdown, some of the policies that were implemented. First time in history that the world shut itself down by choice, all for fear of this virus. At that time, it was not well understood, but now we have a chance to look back, and we can think of various commentaries that we've put out. As a matter of fact, a more recent one I put out just on how, in some respects, there are individuals at the World Health Organization that are reevaluating the value of the lockdowns. And in some respects, this book is really intended not to actually answer every question, but really be one of the first books out there to really try to address this issue of what we did, why we did it, how those decisions were made. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get a little more information about it, of course, the book is entitled The Price of Panic: How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. And we certainly encourage you to look for it in your local bookstore. It is a book that is already out. It is published by Regnery in about 270 pages of material that you will find helpful. And, of course, we also have an article that I've posted by these same authors. The idea of lockdown started with a high school science project. That's one of the things in the book, but you can read that at your leisure as well. And we have three different individuals that have written this. Dr. Doug Axe, as well as Dr. William Briggs, and the individual that we're going to be interviewing now, Dr. Jay Richards. Jay Richards, no stranger to us, because he, of course, has been with the Discovery Institute, actually an assistant professor at the School of Business at Catholic University, author of such books as The Privileged Planet, Money, Greed, and God, and the co-author of this book on The Price of Panic. And I think you're going to find it very helpful, and in some respects find yourself shaking your head in agreement with some of their conclusions. So, Jay Richards, thank you for taking the time to join us today, and thank you for you and your colleagues for writing this book.
Thanks so much, Kerby. Great to be with you.
Let's, if we can, even talk about, as I've mentioned even before you come on the air, the fact that there will be other books, no doubt, that will be written in the future, maybe with such catchy titles as Extraordinary Delusions or The Madness of Crowds. But you're bringing this book out, much of it written when you were still in the lockdown, because we keep hearing about, not only from presidential candidates, from others, that we might have an encore performance next year. And we now know a lot more about COVID-19 than we knew when it first came on the scene, and everybody was starting to panic and started to trust some of these computer models. And so in some respects, that's why you wrote the book, isn't it?
It is. I mean, that was our worry. We can't change the past. We're not going to be able to affect the first two-thirds of 2000 or 2020. But we realized that the arguments that were being used could just as well be used again the next year. And we realized, gosh, a lot of this is based on highly speculative computer modeling that we think almost certainly, at the time, we thought probably wasn't going to be accurate. We now know, in fact, it was not accurate. We thought the best we could do is try to prevent this from happening again. And so really, we wrote the book just with the goal of saying, okay, look, the lockdowns don't make sense. Let's not do this again. As it happens, we ended up actually finding a lot of data and being able to analyze and try to figure out, okay, did the lockdowns actually make a difference? And so even though we were working on it basically from April the 1st until June 1st, and then we got to dip back in it in the middle of the summer, we're really pleased with the way that things have held up. And so we felt like, okay, there's no way we're going to be able to give the distance view that somebody will be able to write in 20 years. But if we can help prevent the country from locking down again, then we feel like we'll have done our job.
You started off by talking about where did the pandemic start? I think we know that, but who started the panic? And a lot of that comes from the World Health Organization. As I read through your book, I would say, oh, yeah, we did talk about that in one commentary. We did talk about that in one roundtable. But it's probably helpful for individuals, especially now that we are starting to see some individuals, in particular David Nabarro at the World Health Organization and others saying, you know, these lockdowns weren't as good as we thought they were, and there were some very dire consequences to that. But this whole idea of a lockdown, this whole idea of a panic came in large part from the World Health Organization, didn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, what's really strange is that in many ways, there was a report that WHO, World Health Organization, did in October of 2019, doing a massive meta-analysis of over 200 scientific papers in which they concluded, well, there's no strong evidence that lockdowns will probably make much difference for an influenza pandemic, which is what they're thinking about at the time. Then suddenly in March, they became cheerleaders for the lockdowns all over the place, which is absolutely bizarre. And in part, I think it's honestly because the Director General saw this computer model at the Imperial College London, which was predicting, 40, 50 million deaths worldwide, 2.2 million deaths in the United States. He essentially glommed onto that model and decided, well, let's just take a flyer and see if this works. Professor Dr. Nabarro's statement here a couple of weeks ago, questioning the lockdowns, it's actually a return to what the World Health Organization's considered opinion was a year ago, which is so strange. But this is why we talk about, in the subtitle of our book, the tyranny of experts, because you can have just a few public health experts, in this case, WHO is the public health arm of the United Nations, wielding unbelievable amounts of power and this capacity to be able to tell presidents and prime ministers, look, millions of people are going to die unless you just shut down your economies, and it happens. But that's effectively what happened. It's a few key players that actually played a role in shutting down the global economy.
One of the things I've posted is a piece that you and your authors actually posted in the stream. Of course, you're one of the editors there, and you find this in the chapter on blind models. But just before we take a break, because it's kind of simple, this idea for the lockdown really came from a high school science project. We're not making this up. And don't believe Jay Richards. You can go back to the article that was in the New York Times where you have this young girl, Lorna Glass, who actually is working on social networks in high school. But her dad picked up on it, and then it ended up being an article in the CDC Journal. But tell us the rest of the story before we take a break.
Yeah, that's effectively it. He's at the Sandia National Labs, which is a major federal laboratory. So, well, this is interesting. And she was essentially postulating that general lockdowns, as opposed to quarantines, might prevent flu sort of spread in her school. And it was, again, she wasn't testing this or simulating it. This was a speculative computer model, and it took a while, but this ended up becoming the intellectual orthodoxy of the CDC. It's just that it had not actually been tested. So basically, we had this new untested idea of general population lockdowns waiting for a pandemic to be tested, and it just happened to happen in 2020, unfortunately.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how it spread, how to create a panic, and then what to do. And there's a whole series of steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, that just help you understand how that happened. And then, of course, we'll get into what is called social manias and the cult of expertise. And we've already kind of alluded to the, if you will, the models. We'll get into that in more detail. And then the rush to the lockdown and a number of other things. Quite a number of chapters in this book, which go through about, in round numbers, about 260 pages. And it really covers the watershed. 14 different chapters published by our good friends at Regnery. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it on our website, and we'll continue with Dr. Jay Richards right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A term being used by certain pollsters is the shy Trump voter. It designates voters who plan to vote for Donald Trump but aren't telling pollsters how they will vote. Some pollsters believe these voters exist, while other pollsters reject the idea. One writer for 538 said that the polling organization found little sign of shy Trump voters. Another report from the American Association for Public Opinion Research found no evidence of such voters. David Catron complains that this is the classic appeal to ignorance. In other words, it is the argument that the absence of proof is the proof of its absence. He explains that such voters are, by definition, hidden. They rarely answer calls or respond to texts, especially from numbers they don't recognize. Even if they do respond to a pollster, they are not likely to be forthcoming. One poll found that 20% of registered voters say they are uncomfortable revealing their preferred candidate. That percentage is much higher when you ask conservatives. A recent Cato Institute poll concluded that the reluctance of conservatives to share their political views has increased from 70% to 77% since 2017. Next week, we'll be able to judge how many of these shy Trump voters actually exist. They may be insignificant, or they may reverse the current predictions. What we do know is that they seem to be quite a number of them 4 years ago. North Carolina provides a good example. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a 7-point lead in the last week in October, but Donald Trump won the state by more than 3%. Polling the electorate is a difficult and complex process. The possibility of hidden voters makes the prediction of next week's election even more difficult than ever. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we are talking with Jay Richards, again, research professor at the School of Business at Catholic University. Some of his co-authors, Dr. Doug Axe is the Maxwell Professor of Molecular Biology at Biola University and also working in the Biologic Institute. William Briggs holds PhD in statistics at Cornell University. And so a lot of great expertise comes into this book, The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. But let's talk about how to create a pandemic, or how to create a panic over the pandemic, I should say. And that is step 1, excessive noticing. Step 2, obsess over cases. Then step 3, compare kiwis to tangelos. We'll get into each one of those. But Dr. Jay Richards, first of all, when you start excessively noticing something, sometimes it looms larger than maybe it really is. Explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know this in our own case. I mean, I'm this way. My wife accuses me of being a perfectionist, and so I'll notice the one flaw, on something and can't notice the rest. But this is actually a real psychological phenomenon. So, for instance, this practice of tabulating and trying to keep a ticker going of every individual death or every individual hospitalization. If we did that in normal life, if we did it for the flu, if we did it for heart attacks, where you just at the bottom of our computer screens, every time someone died of the flu, you saw it click up, we would keep ourselves in a 24/7 panic. Well, that's what we actually tried to do with COVID-19. We're all following these websites, hearing how many cases today, how many deaths, how many hospitalizations. The reality is you can't even actually do that. If you get into the details, there's really no way to count this stuff in real time. We don't do it with the flu. We figure out how many flu deaths there are for a previous year after the year is over. And so just by doing that, we, in some ways, I mean, there's an incentive for the media to talk about it because it draws eyeballs and it draws clicks. But it's really, in many ways, it's designed to keep us in a full-scale panic. What we want to do is say, okay, well, there's always people dying everywhere of something, right? And so that has to be our kind of baseline. And then how does what is happening now compare to that? But we didn't do that. We just were sort of treating individual sicknesses and cases and deaths of COVID-19 in the abstract as if they were just completely out of keeping with the things that normally happen.
Step 2 is, of course, obsess over the cases. By the way, I might just mention when we get into the third one there, you've got some great graphs and charts to show the excess deaths, but you also see that there are peaks and valleys every single year. But again, when you focus on the cases, in some respects, you're majoring on the minors sometimes because so many individuals that did have COVID-19 recovered without any kind of morbidity. And certainly, of course, we had some mortalities, but you have to put that in perspective of the fact that we have more than 300 million people in the country, right?
No, that's right. And then the problem with cases is that the definition of case when we first started working on the book is someone who's symptomatic and sick enough to have to go to the doctor and then tests positive for it. That's a case. Well, now what's happening is that we're testing upwards of 1 million people every single day in the United States, almost all of them asymptomatic. And so what we're getting is a lot of positive tests of people that don't have any symptoms, but we're calling them cases. But the reason you can have this situation where you get the cases going up and deaths and hospitalizations going down is because of a massive increase in testing of people that are asymptomatic. And now we're calling those cases. Again, this is just sort of designed to keep us in a panic when in fact we have to say, well, you know, the virus is still out there. Lots of people are still catching it, and we're testing so much that we're revealing that, but it doesn't tell us anything about whether, you know, it's generally harmful or people are dying from it. That's a different question.
Well, let's get into the third one because it's a little more complex, but I think it's important. Compare kiwis to tangelos or apples to oranges or whatever you want to use. But what you do is, first of all, provide a graph, which I've always suspected that if we look at the weekly U.S. deaths for all causes, we see peaks and valleys, and those peaks sometimes come because of flus and other things, and then valleys. And when you then compare it to where we are, okay, it was more. There were extra deaths. But when you start looking at that in terms of what's a spike and what's a baseline, it isn't as bad as you were led to believe by some of the charts, is it?
No, it's not at all. And that's, of course, we never know about the total excess deaths for a year until the year is over. And so the best we can do is sort of up to the date that we were able to do it. And so it is clear that there's a signal. There's this, as you said, it basically correlates to every flu season in which you get an increase in deaths around the flu season and then it goes down. In fact, that's how we figure out how many people die of flu and pneumonia. It's sort of after you have subtracted deaths from all other known causes, those go on top. And so we say, yeah, there's definitely a signal above that in this year, but it's not, if you sort of stretch it back to 1968, it's probably very comparable to the Hong Kong flu of 1968, which most people don't even remember. It was a bad flu season, but that's what it was. But of course, many of the people that end up dying from COVID-19 are people that might have died of the flu this year anyway. And so that's why you want to ultimately figure out, okay, so how many total excess deaths are there? Well, we're already back to baseline and actually have been for several months. And surprisingly, it looks like we're going to have a record low number of flus. Part of that is because we're counting people that test positive as if they're a COVID case, but also because the reality is that COVID-19 is overwhelmingly the people that it either kills or contributes to their death are near the end of their lives. And so there are many people that, you know, might have died within 6 months of a flu complication. And that's why you want to put this kind of thing in perspective from a public health point of view, because something that kills people when they're 5 is different from something that maybe on average takes a month off of our lives at the end. Those are different public health problems.
That kind of gets us into the chapter on untangling the numbers, because you give us some perspective. Now, you can go all the way back to the 1918 Spanish flu, which, by the way, is really misnamed, but we won't get into all those details. But you take us back to the plague of Athens and the plague of Cyprian and the Justinian plague and a variety of others, because in some respects, when we understand how this fits, and of course even the Black Death in the 14th century, you have a better understanding of what we are dealing with right now, don't you?
You do, because, I mean, we just compare things that we are used to. But we thought, well, what we want is, how has these kinds of things happened historically? And we did the best we could with the numbers. We thought, okay, how do you test how bad a pandemic is? We said, well, let's do it as a percentage of the total population. And so the Spanish flu was catastrophic. It may have killed 40, even possibly 50 million people, but that was in 1917, 1918, when the population was much, much smaller. And so if you do that kind of comparison, the reality is that even since 1958, 1968, the pandemic of 2020 is not by any means historic. It's worse than an average flu season, but it's not something that, the Imperial College London computer model, for instance, estimated an infection fatality rate of 3.4%, which would have meant that it was much worse than the Spanish flu. It's much less significant than the Spanish flu, and yet our response was far more extreme, far more draconian than certainly anything they did in 1917 and 1918. And that's sort of our key point, is you want your response to be appropriate to the risk involved, and not, because, it's sort of like you don't cut your head off to get rid of a headache. You don't shut the entire world down, especially if it's not going to do any good, for something that's, in fact, probably not a historic event in that way.
We're going to take a break, but I just think I might mention that you did talk about the Hong Kong flu, or sometimes it's called the Asian flu. That was in 1957, and 58 was the Asian flu. Of course, you also mentioned the Hong Kong flu in 1968 and 1969. So you can look at the Asian flu or the Hong Kong flu. Asian flu, about 2 million deaths. Hong Kong flu, about 1 million deaths. And again, since I'm the old guy around the table, I remember both of those times because I was alive. But the reality is, for young people, or for people that have a recent memory, they go, well, this is nothing like what we had in some of the more recent cases with the swine flu. But once you start looking at that, and even going back to that idea of the lockdowns, which started with a high school science project, the idea was, well, this might be helpful in dealing with the infection of the 1957 and 58 Asian flu, or of course you might have even said the 1968, 69 Hong Kong flu. But this is, when you look at the comparisons to the other examples, much less. But of course, for the very first time in history, we actually closed down the world by choice. So when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about, okay, that is the numbers. How did this happen? What about these, what are called blind models? Of course, we've talked about the Imperial College research, the one at the University of Washington and others. And what about those models and even the advice coming from the CDC and others that we indeed have to close everything down? I think all of us now are well aware of some of the consequences of closing down the economy, not only in terms of the economy, but also in terms of postponing cancer screenings and vaccines and all sorts of other things. So that will get us into the other aspect of this book, The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. We'll be back right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Jay Richards, one of the authors of this new book, The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. One of the chapters, Jay, is, of course, on blind models, and that brings us to Imperial College London and the attempt to try to pull together some kind of estimate from the idea of what's called the Imperial College Response Team, now Ferguson. And we now know a lot more about the model, which some refer to as having kind of a buggy code. And I think what little experience I've had in writing computer models when I was in graduate school, you actually understand garbage in, garbage out, GIGO. And so first of all, if you don't have the right assumptions, if you don't have enough facts, you can make some big mistakes and some predictions that are wildly inaccurate. And some of that seems to have happened with the Imperial College model, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, what's weird is that Ferguson, and he was about a team of 30 people, he actually has a record going back a decade or 2 decades, making these kinds of predictions when it came to pandemics. And he has unbelievable track record of just getting it wrong by, thousands of orders of magnitude, crazy predictions. And so it's not like, if anything, people that were following this should have been highly skeptical of this model. Instead, the Director General of the World Health Organization just sort of accepted it as gospel. But of course, we're talking March, so you're wondering, okay, well, what data were they using? Well, they didn't have data.
They didn't have it, yeah.
Really to be able to figure out what the infection fatality rate is. They were using a couple of flights out of China, and I think there was sort of a data set of about 6 people or something in one case. And so it's really just a complete conjecture. We should have been treating these computer models as just literally sophisticated conjecture. Then within a few weeks, we found out the model itself, just as models go, was, you said one computer engineer, when they finally got a look at it in April, said it's a buggy mess that looks more like a bowl of angel hair pasta than a finely tuned piece of programming. I mean, it was an absolute mess. It should never have seen the light of day, and it absolutely should never have been treated as if it was evidence that could be sort of secure enough to guide us in terms of a major public policy. But unfortunately, that's exactly what happened.
Well, let's, if we can, talk about then why did we believe lockdowns would work? And that gets into, first of all, a conversation you and I had months ago about masks at a time when you and I said, well, I think masks might be helpful. You had the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, say, no, seriously, people stop buying masks. And I've done a commentary about that for sure.
Right.
And then you have the whole idea of 6 feet. That's kind of interesting because the science of social distancing is something. So kind of take us through that chapter, because in some respects, once you dig a little bit deeper, you go, really? You don't have that much evidence for what you're now telling everybody to do?
No, I mean, that's the frustrating thing. Now, we should just, be honest. Like, the reality is that you can't do randomized controlled trials that involve thousands of people sort of living their lives. So you're never going to get the kind of gold standard. And so what you end up with, things like masks, is so-called mechanistic plausibility. Well, okay, if you wear an N95 and it's really tightly fitted and it's clean and you do everything right, as you do if you're a healthcare worker, then it's going to probably reduce your risk. The problem is that in real life, when we're wearing surgical masks and gaiters over our faces, very quickly all the conditions that you'd need to meet in order for it to make any difference aren't met. And so what you end up being involved in is just really kind of nothing more than hygiene theater. But even these things like you mentioned, the 6-foot rule, if you dig into the data on that, it's actually really, really thin. I mean, it's sort of common sense that obviously a respiratory virus, if people are spread out across the plains in South Dakota wearing hazmat suits, okay, they're less likely to spread the bug than if you're trapped on a subway, in New York City. That makes sense. But the idea of the 6 feet was really based on this assumption that the bug is primarily transmitted by large droplets. So basically, you cough and you spit on someone or something like that. In that case, a surgical mask would prevent you from literally spitting on someone else. Okay, that sort of makes sense. The problem is that the data has been mounting that very often this is actually spread by aerosol, and aerosol is just a very fine particulate stuff that comes out of your breath like smoke. Now, the N95 could still catch some of that, but most of the stuff that most people are doing most of the time, really not going to make a whole lot of difference. Like if it's aerosol, then if you've got a mask that's open on the side, well, you're just pulling the air around the edge of the mask, and it's really not doing anything. And so very quickly you realize, gosh, a lot of this stuff that we seem to be doing, and I honestly think it's more just to kind of keep us busy so we feel like we're doing something that matters. There's just no data, and even the World Health Organization themselves in 2019 said there's just really not any good data that any of this is going to make much difference.
What I love is that you give some of the quotes that I've used before, and that is you got some people saying, well, 6 feet makes some sense, but then you had one, for example, in Taiwan, they had 1.5 meters. The World Health Organization said 1 meter, which would be 3 feet. And then you have one from the actual Public Health Command in Europe recommending you stay 12 feet apart. So you're getting all sorts of answers. But, okay, the skeptic out there, and I'm sure there are some right now, Jay, that are saying, well, okay, you talked about the data and all the rest, but didn't these lockdowns work? And you and your authors devoted an entire chapter. And what I think is so striking, again, I'm sad that this is radio, because if it was television, we could show these graphs. You show with a little kind of a lock when the lockdown started, and you give us some examples of various places around the world and where the lockdown started. And then you would expect that you would have what was, of course, called the flattening of the curve. And when you look at all of these diagrams from different states in the United States, and of course you can also look around the world, you start going, well, it didn't. And it isn't just, oh, well, you did the lockdown and then it takes a couple of weeks for it to flatten the curve. Basically, if you take your graphs seriously, the lockdowns didn't work the way they were supposed to have worked. True?
No, that's exactly right. And that surprised us, to tell you the truth, Kirby. We thought what we would find is that, okay, the government lockdowns, they made some slight difference. It's just that they were so destructive in other ways. And so when we ran all the curves in different countries, and unfortunately we have lots of different U.S. states that did different things, and so you can superimpose on their curves that exact date when the lockdowns happen, and then essentially you count out 10 or 11 days. It takes a while for the bug to cause infection and get tested. You would expect to see a bend down in that curve at 10 or 11 days after the lockdowns. And if you don't know the dates of the lockdowns, you'd never guess where they landed. There's just no signal in the noise at all. And that's really distressing, because if we're going to look at the evidence, it says, well, there's no discernible effect to these government lockdowns. And so it's all cost. There isn't even a minor benefit. It's just basically all cost. That's why we ultimately ended up calling it the price of panic, because the government response, which we thought, well, hopefully there's some gain for the pain, it ends up almost certainly being just all pain.
Well, again, now we'll get to the cost. And Chapter 10 is the human cost. We can talk about, and let's do that. First of all, the human cost in dollars, then the cost in unemployment, and then the cost of deaths of despair that we've talked about, the cost of medical. And let's just, if we can, maybe just before I take the break, just talk about the economic cost of the lockdown. What did you find?
Our estimates are that if you discount what the bug would have cost the economy by itself if we hadn't done the lockdowns, the lockdowns cost the U.S. economy about $1 trillion every month. And since we're still doing it to some degree, we're talking several $1 trillion to the U.S. economy from the lockdown. It's a huge price tag.
Yes, it is. And, of course, the other one is the unemployment issue. But we'll take a break. But, again, you go into that in some detail, because we all are well aware of the fact that there are still a number of individuals, and my wife and I walk twice a day, and we run into different people. And one individual I talk to is still trying to get a job. I know at least one person in my Sunday school class that had a job for a while and doesn't have a job. I mean, I can go through just in my short sphere of influence, family members, other resources, and others of people that are unemployed. But I want to get back after the break and talk about the others, because I've spent some time writing commentaries about the deaths of despair. not to mention the deaths of extreme poverty, as we've talked about various individuals that have been on this program of what has happened to other countries, and the possibility of doubling extreme poverty in the world, doubling child malnutrition, and then long term, the deaths and illnesses from delays in medical care because treatments did not take place, screenings did not take place. And of course, we can talk about crime, we can talk about trust, we can talk about just the whole tyranny and all of the rest. So we will come back and get into the cost, the human cost. And if you find yourself saying, I want to get this book. I want to use this to talk to my elected representatives. I want to use this to write a letter to the editor. Again, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. Stay tuned. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today about the book, The Price of Pandemic, Price of Panic in the Pandemic, I guess I should say. And again, written by a number of authors, including the one that we are talking with right now, Dr. Jay Richards, and a resource that I think you're going to find very helpful. What are the costs? Well, there are economic costs, there are emotional costs, there are social costs. Let's count the ways. And Dr. Jay Richards, first of all, that issue of deaths of despair, the number of suicides and others that have happened because of these lockdowns.
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic. One recent study predicts there will be about 75,000 excess deaths of despair, so suicide, drug, and alcohol overdose. That's excess. We always have lots of these, and unfortunately, these are over and above what you would actually have expected in 2020, and so I think we could attribute virtually all of these to lockdown. You know, there was a study in June that said something like 1 in 4 students under the age of 20 had suicidal ideation in the previous few months. So there's just massive amounts of, and some of that, of course, is unmeasurable. What's measurable are the actual deaths. So I mean, imagine, let's just say it's 75,000 excess deaths. Add that and a couple of other things, and very quickly, you've got as many people dying as a result of the lockdowns as you have from the thing that we were trying to avoid by implementing the lockdowns. That's a really bad public policy.
Let's talk about long-term deaths and illnesses from delays in medical care. That will be playing out for years to come, won't it?
Absolutely. I mean, a Medscape paper, I think in June, actually estimated there were probably about 80,000 missed cancer diagnoses just in March, April, May, and June. So just the few months of the major lockdowns, that's just cancer diagnoses, 80,000 of those in the United States. That's not counting heart disease, stroke, diabetes, other things. And now not all of those will result in death, but many of them will, and many of them will result in sickness that people would not have had to suffer. This is all the result of, remember, that early idea that we needed to flatten the curve. And so flatten the curve, lock things down so that the hospital systems don't get overrun. And so what happened is the hospitals basically emptied out their wards. They canceled all elective procedures, which just means it was on the calendar, it was scheduled, basically opening up beds on the assumption that they were going to be flooded with COVID patients. Well, of course, people are still getting sick and dying of lots of other things, but unfortunately there was a period of several months where basically the only sicknesses and deaths that seemed to count were ones that were associated with COVID-19. Well, this is turning out to be an absolute catastrophe, and as you said, we won't really know how many total deaths are netted as a result of that for some years, because of course if you had cancer that could have been caught early on that is more advanced, maybe you don't die from that for 3 or 4 years, but it's something that could have been prevented. This is something that, there were scientists and public health experts at the time that were warning of this. It's not as if there was a scientific consensus. It's just that the ones that happened to be advising presidents and prime ministers were all in favor of the lockdown, unfortunately, and there were no contrary voices to be had.
Well, and again, let's talk about a couple others that maybe haven't occurred to people. Wasted goods, because after all, you can't tell chickens to stop laying eggs, cows to stop producing milk, but when you don't have a restaurant to send them to, when you don't have school lunch programs to send them to, that changed everything. The issue of crime, because in many cases, they were releasing various criminals, some of whom were actually dangerous criminals into the world. That was dangerous. And so you go through just this long list of things that people maybe never thought about. But maybe we should, before we run out of time, talk about who got it right, because you do have a chapter about that. And whether you look at Taiwan or whether you look at Sweden or Japan or a variety of others, or even some of the states in this country, what can we learn going forward?
Well, there's no evidence either from the states or from individual countries that lockdowns do any good. In fact, there's a reverse correlation. We're not claiming this is causation, but basically the countries that tended to do the best were the ones that didn't have lockdowns, and the ones that did the worst are the ones that did. Now, part of that is that I think that some countries just panicked and responded in a certain way. Nevertheless, there are several Asian countries. My co-author, William Briggs, he got stranded in Taiwan. He went over there for work and was there for the entire writing of our book. And he said, well, in Asia, at the drop of a hat, East Asians are much more likely to put masks on. They just kind of do it reflexively, and so it's hard to say what difference that makes. But he said, there was never anything like a lockdown that we had. Churches were sort of restricted for a few weeks, school very temporarily, and then they opened back up. Of course, Taiwan is an island country, so they do benefit in that way. But Hong Kong, which is actually part of China, seemed to do fine. Vietnam seems to actually do really well. We suspect there's probably some pre-existing immunity that explains part of that, and so we wouldn't want to put all of our eggs in that basket. We think there's something different happening in Asia. But Sweden actually is the one that everyone talked about. Now, it's true that Sweden had greater deaths per capita than its neighbor Norway, but that's the one, you don't do statistics by comparing two data points. You got to look at all the countries, say, in Europe. Well, Sweden did much better than Belgium and the UK, both of which had draconian lockdowns, and Belgium is just right there by Sweden. So the latitude, the general culture are very much the same. In fact, Sweden's main mistake was really not focusing on nursing homes. The Swedes have lots of their old folks that are in nursing homes. They're congregated together, and we now know that's a really dangerous place for people. They should have done a lot more to really focus their protection on nursing homes. But other than that, we think that the Swedish model is actually the right one. You just need to focus more attention on the people that are really at risk. But now Sweden is completely back to normal. They did not devastate their economy. They're not walking around in masks. They're not terrified. We've got, there's all these uncountable costs. What's the cost of tens of millions of children having to wear masks and think of their fellow human beings, not as potential friends and neighbors, but as potential carriers of deadly pathogens? There's just kind of countless things that are hard to measure, but that you have no doubt are going to impose dramatic social and psychological costs on us. The idea that we would talk about doing this again, especially given what we've learned already, is just absolutely terrifying.
We are certainly out of time, but I just thought I'd mention, too, there are some political costs, and never let a crisis go to waste. And you've had the governor of California saying that this was an opportunity to pursue his agenda. Matter of fact, they even had an article in The Nation, how not to waste this crisis. And you have the governor of Oregon basically wanting to use this, as well as others in various states, to close down religious groups, which we've talked about with Kelly Shackelford. So there are some other, if you will, political aspects of it. But just before we run out of time, again, the reason I know you guys wrote this book is because you're convinced that there might be somebody that says, we need another lockdown. And the evidence suggests that no, we don't. This might be actually doing more harm than good. And you've documented that in the book. So I appreciate you and Doug and Bill writing this book on the price of panic, how the tyranny of experts turned a pandemic into a catastrophe. And as always, Dr. Jay Richards, you've just done a great job of pulling together facts, figures, and information, and a very extensive set of endnotes in case somebody says, no, I want to read that for myself. And so the book is available in the bookstores, but we also have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. So Jay Richards, as always, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure, Kerby. Great to be with you.
We are going to actually encourage you to find out more about this book by going to the website, pointofview.net. We have gone through just an unprecedented time, first time in history where the world basically shut itself down by choice, all from the fear of the pandemic and the virus. It was not well understood at the time, and the government had our support, and we had lots of facts and figures that were thrown at us, and we said, well, I guess this is what we need to do. But now on the other side of it, we're recognizing that there were incredible costs, not just economic costs, but emotional costs and social costs and even political costs that we need to address. And that's why we wanted to cover this particular program today here on Point of View. And if you find yourself saying, well, I've got to read it for myself, that's what we want you to do. It's published by Regnery, The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. And you've been listening to Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and this time next week, I would think we have a pretty good idea of who the next president is, but there's always the possibility that could go into overtime. As I'll talk about in just a few minutes, we may or may not know who controls the United States Senate. That also could go into overtime, and I'm thinking of those of you that live in Georgia. We'll talk about that in just a minute as well. But a lot of the decisions have already been made. The best estimates are at least 74 million Americans have already voted. Still have 6 days left, so you think about that, 74 million, that's a pretty significant number given the fact that last time we had 138 million people that voted. About 136 million voted for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, which left about 2 million that did not. And I'm going to get into that today in a little more detail in just a minute. If you take the polls seriously, and there are reasons to question it and reasons to accept it, and I won't get into all the details, at least the Cook Political Report estimates that even in the unlikely scenario that Donald Trump wins all of the toss-up states and has not only those states which are solid Republican and likely Republican, he would still lose, because the assumption is made, at least from the Cook Report, that about 290 electoral votes are in either solid, likely, or leaning. You only need 270. So some things would have to change dramatically in a couple of those leaning states. And we're talking about states that last time Donald Trump won narrowly: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, maybe some others. He went to New Hampshire and others. But what is so striking is some of the toss-up states: Florida, Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina, Ohio, and for the first time, Texas is put into the toss-up category. I still think Donald Trump and the Republican candidate for the Senate, John Cornyn, will win that, but it just, again, illustrates that there are much easier paths for the Biden-Harris ticket to win than there are for the Trump-Pence ticket to win. And so we certainly have paid some attention to those polls, but again, the only poll, as I've said, matters are the ones that are going to be counted Tuesday and Tuesday night. I thought for just a minute, we're going to later this hour get into a conversation with John Kingston about what are called First Principle Project. And that is, he's really concerned, as we have been around this table more than once, that Christians aren't necessarily thinking biblically about these issues. No matter who is elected next Tuesday, no matter what happens in the House, the Senate, and the Oval Office, I think it is incumbent upon us to really begin to spend some time talking about these biblical principles that relate to a variety of different ideas. And so we're going to be talking with him about his project, but also about how the National Association of Evangelicals put together a booklet that has key verses and scriptural principles that we should use as we are evaluating policies and even candidates. But I thought before we do that, I might acknowledge the fact that there are a number of pastors and prominent Christian leaders that have been speaking out either for or against Donald Trump. And so just in the interest of fairness, I want to quote just briefly from some of the things that Al Mohler, who's been on the program with us before, has said, and then some of the things Pastor John Piper has said. And, of course, they come to different conclusions. And so I want to try to put that on the table, then also spend some time talking about, how people have responded to it. I've been encouraged, first of all, before we get into this, by the fact that there are more pastors that are finally addressing some of these issues. There was a tendency not so long ago to say, well, those are political issues. We're not going to address those from the pulpit. If you get my booklet on the patriot preachers, you understand that during the 18th century, these pastors were in the pulpits educating their congregation about how a Christian is to think about those issues. And even a few years ago, we probably would have not seen John MacArthur, I'll pick somebody else, speaking out about these issues because he'd actually written a book saying, really, getting involved in politics is a waste of time. It involves compromise. It takes us away from from evangelism and the gospel. By the way, I don't disagree with some of the things he said in the book. But now, all of a sudden, he's starting to speak out and say anybody that votes for somebody who's pro-abortion should not do so as a Christian. And I just think it's encouraging that the individuals I'm going to quote from, whether I agree with everything they say or not, are really wanting to actually address these issues. Okay, first up, Al Mohler's been on the program with before, and he points out in a piece that came out called Christians' Conscience and the Looming 2020 Election that he didn't support Donald Trump 4 years ago. Matter of fact, he acknowledges, and I remember this, spoke out multiple times against Donald Trump as the Republican nominee, and even wrote in the summer of 2016 that evangelicals were tragically being urged to support the lesser of two evils. So, okay, he was not in favor of voting for Donald Trump. I think he's implying that he did not, but I don't know what he did. Maybe he didn't vote anyway, or maybe he skipped over, as millions of Americans did last time. But then he goes on to say, I was wrong. I have no means of reading Donald Trump's heart on this issue, but I can easily evaluate his actions. In terms of presidential action, Donald Trump has been the most effective and consequential pro-life president of the modern age, which, again, as we mentioned yesterday, was pretty surprising for some of us around this table. In both executive actions and court appointments, Donald Trump has gone far beyond what would have been politically necessary to secure his base. He then goes on and does a contrast with the Democrats and points out that some people try to say that Democrats, in matter of fact, you have even the fact checker saying Democrats do not support abortion right to the moment of birth. And he said, but you can easily look at the party platform and the statements and all the rest to show that it is very much in favor of abortion, as are the two individuals running on the Democratic side. And then he makes one other strong case, and that is the issue of religious liberty. He says President Trump has corrected many of the infringements on religious liberty caused by the policy mandates of previous administrations. He has made religious liberty an American priority at home and abroad. And so then spends some time talking about, again, the difference between both Republicans and Democrats and between the nominees. The part that, of course, sometimes is missing is the part we're going to talk about after the break with John Piper. All of the behavior of Donald Trump, the impact that can have on the coarsening of our culture and a number of other things. So the people that have maybe been critical of Al Mohler say, yes, the policies have been good, but I think most of us would like to vote for an individual who is a Christian, who has good character, who has integrity, who is right on the issues, which we'll talk about later this hour, what is a Christian view on many of these issues, and also surrounds himself with various individuals that also will take that policy and move it forward. And the argument that they would make against Al Mohler is you have an individual that doesn't have good character, and sometimes Donald Trump doesn't necessarily surround himself with the best kind of people. And so that's the argument we've heard before. He would probably come back, if I can put words in his mouth, and say, that's probably true, but if you're looking for somebody with good character, somebody's a Christian, somebody has a Christian worldview and has good people in policy positions, that looks like the Vice President Mike Pence. And even though I may not like the character of the president, I do have a lot of agreement with the vice president, and recognizing that I think both that vice president and, as we'll talk about in just a minute, the vice president for the Democratic Party, probably going to have a lot more influence than ever before. Let's go back and we'll hear from Pastor John Piper right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
term being used by certain pollsters is the shy Trump voter. It designates voters who plan to vote for Donald Trump but aren't telling pollsters how they will vote. Some pollsters believe these voters exist, while other pollsters reject the idea. One writer for 538 said that the polling organization found little sign of shy Trump voters. Another report from the American Association for Public Opinion Research found no evidence of such voters. David Catron complains that this is the classic appeal to ignorance. In other words, it is the argument that the absence of proof is the proof of its absence. He explains that such voters are, by definition, hidden. They rarely answer calls or respond to texts, especially from numbers they don't recognize. Even if they do respond to a pollster, they are not likely to be forthcoming. One poll found that 20% of registered voters say they are uncomfortable revealing their preferred candidate. That percentage is much higher when you ask conservatives. A recent Cato Institute poll concluded that the reluctance of conservatives to share their political views has increased from 70% to 77% since 2017. Next week, we'll be able to judge how many of these shy Trump voters actually exist. They may be insignificant, or they may reverse the current predictions. What we do know is that they seem to be quite a number of them 4 years ago. North Carolina provides a good example. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a 7-point lead in the last week in October, but Donald Trump won the state by more than 3%. Polling the electorate is a difficult and complex process. The possibility of hidden voters makes the prediction of next week's election even more difficult than ever. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, get into a couple of other statements that have been made. And again, I applaud these individuals, even as I may agree or disagree with some of the points they make, because I think it is healthy and helpful that we have pastors and Christian leaders speaking out on some of these moral and social issues which have a political component. And this argument that it's all politics and I won't address it from the pulpit, won't teach it in a Sunday school class, has not been helpful. And that, of course, is a great setup to what we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes with John Kingston of the First Principles Project. But let's get the other side, and that is John Piper has also addressed this issue, in which he said he may not be voting for Donald Trump. Later on, there was a Twitter post in which he confirmed that he was not voting either for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And let me take on one criticism, which I thought was unfair, saying, well, then that means you're not going to vote. No, it means he may just skip over that particular office, or it could be that he might think about voting for a third-party candidate, and I'm going to talk about the third-party candidates in just a minute. So that isn't necessarily the case, although I have, let's be fair, seen a few people that said, look, I can't in good conscience vote for Donald Trump, I can't in good conscience vote for Joe Biden, so I won't vote. Oh, wait a minute. We have more than 30,000 elections taking place on Tuesday. And even if you have to skip over anything, whether you say I can't vote for either candidate for the Senate or for mayor or whatever, I think there's still a responsibility to go and vote. But anyway, let's give John Piper a chance to address this issue. He says, I think it is a drastic mistake to think that the deadly influences of a leader come only through his policies and not through his person. He talks about flagrant boastfulness, vulgarity, immorality, factitious, I guess I'd say, not only self-incriminating, but they're nation corrupting. And so he says, I'm not making an endorsement, but here I'm not trying to dictate how someone else should vote. But he does go on and say he is baffled that so many leaders consider the sins of unrepentant sexual immorality, unrepentant boastfulness, unrepentant vulgarity, and the like to be only toxic for our nation, while policies that endorse baby killing, sex switching, freedom limiting, socialistic overreach are viewed as deadly. And so the point he's making is that when you only look at the policies and you don't look at the character of the individual, that is a concern of his. And so, again, he says it is true not only because flagrant boastfulness, vulgarity, immorality, and others are self-incriminating, but also because they are nation-corrupting. They move from the centers of influence to infect our whole cultures. And then he went on to also say, I find it bewildering that Christians can be so sure that greater damage will be done by bad judges, bad laws, and bad policies than is being done by the culture-infecting spread of gangrene of sinful self-exaltation, boasting, and strife-stirring. So I think you kind of get the idea here. He also, to be fair, refers to abortion as wickedness and talks about this kind of behavior. And it brings us back to the point that many people have missed, I think, when they've said, well, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, but I'm just going to excuse Hawley's behavior. No, I don't think we can excuse that behavior. I think, if anything, no matter who is elected this Tuesday, and I'm hoping by Tuesday and Wednesday of next week we will know who that is, we have to, as Christians, really address this issue of the coarsening of the culture. Now, is all of that coming from the Oval Office? No, but it is coming from Hollywood. It's coming from the media. It's coming from pop culture. It's coming from music. It's coming from videos. It's coming from a variety of areas. But a source of that has been some of the tweets and other statements that have been made by the president. So on the one hand, I certainly endorse his concern about the behavior. A person that sometimes says, and we've heard this before from athletes, I'm not a role model. Yes, you are. You are a role model, whether you think you are or not. And this is going to be something that will need to be addressed. And so John Piper is, with maybe stronger language, saying something that I've heard even in studio here from Max Lucado and a number of others, and that is, I want a good role model up there for my kids, and I don't have it. And I recognize that sometimes trying to find a good role model in the entertainment field, in athletics, and in politics is really hard to find. And so that's, I think, a concern that he has. Now, the question that people, of course, put to him is, well, then, does that mean you're not going to vote? And the implication is, reading between the lines here on his Twitter post, is he will vote, but he may not vote for either of those two candidates. So, could he vote for a third-party candidate? Well, we have a number of third-party candidates. For example, the Libertarian Party is Jo Jorgensen. And by the way, she's registered in all 50 states. All the others are not. Matter of fact, years ago when we have had Howard Phillips on, who was the original starter of what today is called the Constitution Party, he points out how difficult it is because so many states where you have to register to get on the ballot are so tied into a two-party system that trying to create a third party has been very difficult. Don't think so? Ask Ross Perot when he was alive what it was like to try to get the Reform Party going. Ask Howard Phillips when he was alive how hard it was to get the Constitutional Party on all 50 states. So only the Libertarian Party, for those of you out there that even want to vote third party, is available in all 50 states. But then you have some others. You have the Green Party, Howie Hawkins. You have the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which I thought was kind of interesting because we used to have, of course, it was called the Communist Party, Gloria Lavrivia. You have the Alliance Party, Rocky de la Fuente, the Constitution Party, Don Blankenship, the Independent Party, Brock Pierce. I have to mention this one, if for no other reason than Kanye West Party. You know what it's called? the birthday party. So I'm not making this up. Okay. And the American Solidarity Party. So there we go on the third parties. Now, most of you probably will not vote third party, but I think for just a minute, that brings me to something else I wanted to say, and we might get into more of it in the next hour. But is it possible that Democrats will hold the House of Representatives? Certainly. I mean, I don't see anybody now that thinks that Republicans could take back control of the House of Representatives. Now, is it possible then that Democrats could also take over the Senate? And the answer is possibly, because many people think right now some of the Republicans will lose. That would be Cory Gardner in Colorado, Susan Collins in Maine, Martha McSally in Arizona, Joni Ernst in Iowa, maybe even Tom Tillis, which would be 5. But, of course, then Republicans probably will take back Doug Jones. But if Democrats only need 4, that gives them 4, and that gives them control of the Senate. Maybe. Of course, some of those may go the other direction. But now it brings it down to those of you listening in Georgia. For the rest of you people in the country, let me just mention that in Georgia right now, you have the possibility that third-party candidates will prevent us from knowing on election night who won those 2 races, because you have a general election in Georgia, and then you have a special election in Georgia. And it's possible that in both of those, but especially in the special election, that indeed neither of, or no, I shouldn't say neither, because in some cases we have 3 candidates, any of the candidates will get the requisite 50%. So it is quite possible that 1, maybe 2 of the elections in Georgia will not be decided as a runoff till January 5th. So let's go back and look at those numbers. Let's say I really do think that Susan Collins and Martha McSally win. I don't know, Tom Tillis, maybe Johnny Ernst, maybe they pull it out. So then it's close. We won't even know who would control the United States Senate till the runoffs, which are in January 5th. So as I've said before, there is all the potential that this election could go into overtime, maybe on the presidential side, but almost certainly on the U.S. Senate side. And as we all know, the Senate so important in terms of the confirmation of judges, the ratification or defeat of treaties, and a variety of other things. So if nothing else, just wanted to educate you on that. And much of that created simply because we have a multi-party system. And in some cases, the third-party candidates are able to pull enough votes away. Just ask George Herbert Walker Bush when he was alive, or Al Gore, and you can certainly see how in some cases third-party candidates have made a difference, even in presidential elections. It's pretty clear to me that at least 1, maybe 2 of the Senate elections in Georgia might go into overtime as well. And it just kind of brings us back to the fact that there'll always be something to talk about on these issues here on Point of View. When we come back, I want to focus some time and attention on our friend John Kingston. He's been on with us before, and he's put together what is called the First Principles Project. It is really important for us to make sure going forward, no matter who is elected, that we are thinking biblically about these issues and applying biblical principles to these social and cultural issues around us. So we're going to be talking about him, about that, right after these messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We welcome back to the microphone John Kingston, who's been with us before, lawyer by training, businessman by experience, individual that established America Awakening. We want to talk about the First Principles Project and also point you to a booklet that came out a while back from the National Association of Evangelicals for the Health of a Nation, an evangelical call to civic responsibility. He is an individual that has also run as candidate for the United States Senate and has been very much involved in the concern about the soul of America. So, John, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, John, so good to be back with you. Thank you for having me back.
Talk about the First Principles Project, because this is a partnership between Christianity Today, National Association of Evangelicals, the American Awakening, and it's really a need, and it's a real critical need, which we've talked about with George Barna on this program before, about the need for Christians to really take biblical truths and a biblical worldview and know how to apply it to the social and cultural issues of our day.
Well, that's correct. And look, we are really struggling as people of faith to live a life which is consistent with our Christian callings and our Christian principles in the public square. I'll just be straight with your audience that, for decades and decades now, we've had either a very poor public square theology, how we're supposed to be in the community and the country, or we've had no public square theology at all, and it turns us into people who are just misinformed, people who are being discipled on subjects of how we're supposed to be as citizens in our country and community by people like Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity or somebody other. They will, be the Christians of different stripes will be listening to those folks 20 hours a week and get 1 hour every year or two from a pastor about how we're supposed to be in the political world. And so that's just turned into a real challenge, and that's what prompted us to get this thing going.
And again, if you want to talk about the younger generation, one of the people we love to have on this program with some regularity is Jeff Myers. And because he does such work with young people at Summit Ministries, he said that, the biggest problem is that oftentimes evangelicals gear up and engage the political cycle, but then they just go on to their other issues. And he says, if you look at young church-going Christians, and this is in his article that appeared just last week in the Washington Times, these young church-going Christians aren't fighting the leftward current, they're swimming in it. And that is a comprehensive study of evangelical youth revealed that 69% who attend church do not believe in absolute truth and agree that if your beliefs offend someone, your belief is wrong, more than 5 times as likely as their older peers to embrace Marxist or socialist ideas. So I can go through those numbers, but we've also gone through those even with the older generation, as we've talked about with George Barna. So in some respects, we need to get back to first principles, and that's what the project's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the project, and we hope this, we launched into this cycle because we sense such a great need for people. The conflict in the church is so deep. The different values which are competing for airspace, but very few of them, are actually ones where, folks of faith are following the truest principles of our faith. That we're called as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, to first of all, love God, of course, we get that bit, but to love your neighbor as yourself. That's the only value which Jesus told us to follow in terms of our horizontal relationship with the people on the planet. The whole law and the commandments is caught up in that, and then he embodied that by showing exactly who it is we're supposed to be in loving our neighbors as ourselves. His stories about the Good Samaritan and his own engagement with the Samaritan woman at the well. People who were, Jesus in this case, are acting, profoundly and transcendently across great divides. These were cultural divides which were enormous, in that time. And Jesus was modeling a way in which, okay, so we're supposed to really love our neighbors. So 330 million Americans. That's our job as people of faith. How is it best that we can love them in the public space? And then, of course, Paul went on with you're not Jew nor Greek or slave nor free, male or female in Christ. So basically this idea that we are supposed to go beyond, these, like sort of the culture will say, well, you're Democrat, you're Republican, you're liberal, you're green, you're whatever. Well, you know what? In our teaching, we're supposed to be thinking about people along a different axis and along a different vector. Just jumping topics here a little bit, but it's the same principle. But, the country was founded 244 years ago, deeply informed by our Judeo-Christian tradition and the all are created equal idea. We breathe life into that. And when the concept of all are created equal is given real life, then we can't treat each other badly in the public square, because somehow or other we understand that God has created us as the children of God, equal as a citizen in this country. And however much I disagree with your values over there, you are as much of a child of God and a citizen of this country as I am. And so that changes your take on all this, and it should fashion the way we're supposed to be, to each other and with each other in the public square.
Let's see if we can talk about some of these resources, because I know we have a number of people, John, that are listening, that are pastors, maybe Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, and they say, okay, I don't feel terribly equipped in all of this. I went to seminary, I went to Bible college, never took a class in political science. I don't really understand some of that. I mean, I know that the Bible does sort of address it, but these are some issues maybe I could use some help on. You have a media library which includes some really great sermons from a veritable who's who of individuals that have been on this program. So that's the first resource. Also, a number of years ago, I mentioned, and I've got it in front of me right here, actually printed out rather than in booklet form, from the National Association of Evangelicals for the Health of a Nation, an evangelical call to civic responsibility. And if people say, well, I'm not sure how to speak to those issues, you got 8 chapters here on everything from religious liberty, the sanctity of human life, marriage, justice, human rights, racial justice, the whole issue of just peace and violence, caring for God's creation, kind of just a whole smattering of great material. So what would be available to listeners either who want to train themselves and maybe use this even at a home Bible study, or most importantly for some of the leaders right now to know that you are bringing together sermons from people that have been on this program with us for many years?
Well, thank you for that segue. I really appreciate that. Yeah, and yes, this was put out there a handful of weeks ago for this cycle for exactly the issue you note. People don't know how to talk about it, and in a church these days, between Black Lives Matter considerations on one side, which will encourage some people but alienate others, between pro-Trump positions, which will encourage some people but alienate others. Pastors or spiritual leaders just don't know what words to say, and that's what we found. We were working closely with pastors around the country, and they're just stuck. They're afraid to say anything. And so what we tried to do was pull together, as you say, some of the greats of the current era: Tim Keller and Tony Evans and J.D. Greer and Andy Stanley and others, and what they've said in the last year on this topic. So we put on the website, number one, their actual sermons. You can watch it in video form, but we also transcripted them to make them available for people to think about as resources. Now, the NAE white paper is fantastic, but white papers are notoriously hard to get through. I mean, most normal people are even wonky people, a little bit like myself, don't want to read white papers. And so what we tried to do was fashion materials for this year in this cycle. That's where we created 3 different sermons: Citizens of the Kingdom of Heaven, 1; Citizens of the Country, 2; and Citizens of Your Community, 3.
Right.
And we created outlines for them. We created discussion, topics for them. We created the actual full text version of the sermons themselves. And then we had a great variety of Black, white, Latino, Asian, young, old folks who are delivering portions of them, just to say, hey, we're this is a body of believers across the spectrum, speaking these words together to say this is what God asks of us. So I was excited to be part of the project, and I'm real honored to have had the chance to partner with Christianity Today and National Association of Evangelicals in that regard. one more resource I'll throw out there for your listeners. If they are pastors, in addition to the materials we've got there, we're hosting a webinar at 4:00 tomorrow afternoon with some of the greatest current ministers in American life who will be attending on panelists on our webinar.
Sure.
We'll be speaking these topics as well. So look up on Christianity Today. You'll find information about our webinar, about pastoring in a polarized age.
We're going to take a break, and we'll come back. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those resources, but this might even be something you might want to use in your preparation for Sunday. We'll take a break, come back with more with John Kingston right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Kingston with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Next hour, I'm going to open up the phones and give some of you a chance to make some comments, as we've already been talking about a number of issues, but also we've been talking about this election and some of the other issues that are front and center. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. As a program note, let me just mention that before the next hour is over, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking with Debbie Wuthnow, because the iVoterGuide is now complete. Each day I received, now we have Texas, now we have Alabama, now we have Michigan. Last one is now we have New Hampshire. So all 50 states are available. And so if you are in the process of making decisions about who to vote for further down the ballot, because up now I've been talking about the presidential election, a little bit about the senatorial election, you can click on the iVoterGuide, put in your zip code, and you can then get that. You can also click on the button for your state, and it will give you voting information that you might want to have as well. And so then there are all sorts of voter guides and all such other resources. So if you haven't taken advantage of the iVoterGuide, we'll be talking about that with her. But John, just for a few more minutes, let's talk about these issues, because it does seem to me that whoever is elected for the presidency and the Senate and Congress, we're going to have to do some very significant work inside our churches and inside our homes to get the next generation even up to speed with how to think about these issues from a Christian point of view. And if there's one thing that we've learned from George Barna, who's been on the program about every 4 to 6 weeks, is he brings some new revelation about how we have a whole generation of young people, not to mention some of the oldsters as well, who just aren't thinking biblically about issues. And so it is incumbent upon us to take advantage of things like the First Principles Project to begin to educate individuals and not just say, well, the election's over, we won't talk about politics again for another 2 years. We need to recognize that we need to be much more effective in terms of engaging the public arena, don't we?
Oh, totally agree with you on all those points. I'm going to take it one step further, though. I think the reason that we've lost or are in danger of losing, and some degree have lost the succeeding generations, is for the following reason: that we have not been paying enough attention to this ourselves. I'm an older guy. I'm 55, Kirby. I'm probably your generation. I'm not sure your exact age. And, since I've been in the game, since the 80s, let's call it, I have not seen any meaningful, helpful teaching on these points. And so the generation who's our age has not been fashioned in such a way to live coherent, consistent lives with the gospel and the gospel truths.
Right.
And so then the generations that follow look to us and say, wait a second, you guys aren't acting it, you say the values are, over here, and you say the values over here, but then the way you act in the public square isn't consistent with your gospel values. And, the one thing that's most alienating to a generation that follows is hypocrisy and inconsistency. It's just really hard for people who follow on in the generations, after to look forward to their parents and forebears and say, wait a second, you're not living up to those principles either. So the love your neighbor bit, I'm not seeing much of that, in the way the church is conducting itself. The church has been conducting itself in ways which is concerned with second principles, how people should behave. I mean, which, believe me, Kirby, I'm a conservative, and I'm a moral conservative. I'm a political conservative, and so I don't think these issues are of no consequence at all. But sexual choices of other human beings that are not yourself, those are important. And when we love somebody, we can help them say, hey, it really ought to be X or Y or Z to live your most flourishing life. But if we're concerned about those questions about how people are supposed to conduct their lives, those are second principles for sure. First principles are God's love for us, our love for our neighbor, and therefore how that's supposed to radiate again through this amazing democratic republic that we have. And so I think you drive all the way back to first principles on these topics, and yes, you're right, truth. But the most important truth of all is that God came here to the planet to be amongst us and to teach us a new way about how we're supposed to love each other and take care of each other in the church, if nothing else. That was Jesus' final prayer, with his brethren. At the final Passover meal, he prayed, God, make these guys I'm leaving behind be one, because you're going to see, people on the planet are going to see, who you are, Father, and who I was, and coming here through them when they're actually unified and loving each other. And then he went on to pray that further for the people that, that weren't there with him at the time, but us, that we would all be unified and love each other. So somehow or other, when we're not doing that, but we're getting concerned about certain other principles, other concerns in the electoral arena more seriously than the kids, so to speak. I've got kids in their 20s and married, and I know they're not kids anymore, but they look up and they say, wait a second here, this doesn't quite make sense. So a long way around you, Kerby, and thanks for letting me prattle on this. But the point is that I think we have to look ourselves in the mirror, look seriously at the subject of, have we been living consistent with this? What would God have for me, not only to pass down our faith to the next generation, but how I'm supposed to live my faith consistently right now in this very, very tough and contentious time that we live in.
Let's again just talk about some of the resources available at First Principles Project. And of course, you have citizens of the kingdom, citizens of the country, citizens of the community. Then if you click through, you can watch the video. There's a hard copy of the sermon. There's a sermon outline. There are discussion questions. So it is essentially plug and play in terms of that material. And then if you go up a little earlier, you will also see that there are all sorts of various video sermons from people like Brian Wilkerson and Amy Black and Charles Stanley and J.D. Greer. Of course, we mentioned Tony Evans, N.T. Wright, as well as Richard Mao, Russell Moore, as Tim Keller. The list goes on and on. Eugene Cho. Even some others, Sojourn Rom. Many of these people have been on this program with us. And so if you find yourself saying, I really need to teach this, and maybe even take some of this and use it in a Sunday school lesson this Sunday or a church message, people are probably going to be thinking about the election even more this Sunday. But even after the election, I hope you'll take the resources that are available. And John Kingston, if nothing else, I want to thank you for putting them together for us. And I really thank you for coming on the program with us as well.
Kerby, I'm a big fan of yours. I enjoy being on with you. You're a very, very thoughtful observer of what's happening out there, and I appreciate you creating this forum and vehicle. Thanks so much.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, first of all, it's about time to say, now that we've seen some of these interviews that have been done, and last night, especially with Tucker Carlson, Tony Bobulinski, who was the former business partner of Hunter Biden, really had in a no-holds-barred interview for about 45 minutes, enough evidence that I would think convince anybody other than those who just want to turn a blind eye to it, that indeed this is not Russian misinformation, but in fact some of the corruption that people have in the past accused the Biden family of is really true. And even if Joe Biden is elected, may haunt him as he actually steps into the Oval Office. So we'll talk about this. Then what are some of the, if you will, tax implications of what the Biden-Harris plan would mean? And so I've posted this piece by Nick Gillespie, so we'll get into that. And then also posted a piece on concerns about whether or not there might be unrest after the election and what that might mean. So we will get into those issues. And then we'll finish off by talking about the great resources available at iVoterGuide. Recognize a very high percentage of you have already voted, but if you have not, those resources are still available for you to use. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time looking at one of the big scandals that is not being covered by the mainstream media. Then we'll get into some of the other issues related to the campaign. And before this hour is up, we'll also talk with an individual who is the president of iVoterGuide, and an individual that has been taking so much time, energy, and resources to educate you about where the candidates stand. And I think they've done an outstanding job. And I thought it would be good to let you know that if you have not taken advantage of the iVoterGuide material, it is still linked on our website, pointofview.net, and you can click on that button, then start clicking, put in your zip code. You can see what provide material is available there. You can click on the picture of the various states and see what other statewide information is there, and hopefully we'll give you as much information as possible to cast an informed vote. Now, I must admit, 74 million, now it's almost up to 75 million people have indeed voted. So I recognize that for many of you, that is already in the rear view mirror. But nevertheless, let me make that available to you. And I thought I'd just at least talk about what is available at the iVoterGuide so that you have access to it if you need it. And most importantly, if you need it in the future, they will continue to be doing this on a regular basis, and appreciate the good work that goes into that. It's pretty extensive, and we will talk about that in about a half an hour. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to some of those phone calls in just a minute. But my first story here that is on the website, and I'm sure some of you are saying, why didn't you cover that? Well, I thought we'd cover some other things first. It's called the Biden-Bobulinski testimony. Has to do with the fact that for these last few days, we've heard of a man by the name of Tony Bobulinski. Who is he? Well, he was one of the former business partners for Hunter Biden. He felt like his reputation was being smeared, especially when people who knew that he had been involved with the Biden family were saying all of this was Russian disinformation. Now, here's a man that has served with distinction in the military, had a very high security clearance, and who nevertheless was being smeared, he felt, as being just part of some kind of Russian disinformation campaign, and maybe even like a Russian agent. So he said, enough is enough. Now, last night he sat down with Fox News' Tucker Carlson in really kind of a no-holds-bar interview for 45 minutes, something that was very, very different than anything I've ever seen oftentimes before. So you didn't have a lot of cuts in and out and those kinds of things. You just had a chance to hear him tell his story. But it is more than him telling his story. If it was just he said, the other he said, she said, you know how that goes. You go, what do I know? But, of course, he has made available various email answers. And, of course, a lot of this surfaced more than a week ago when the New York Post actually posted all sorts of information and published information, first about Ukraine, then about China, that came from the laptop of Hunter Biden. It has been hard for me to even take seriously the comment that this was Russian disinformation, since nobody's denying that this is Hunter Biden's laptop. Nobody really is denying that those pictures of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and his brother and others are indeed pictures of them, which were not photoshopped or anything like this. And then, most importantly, you have all sorts of incriminating emails, which range from the Well, Joe Biden lied. What's new? About saying he didn't know what his son, Hunter Biden, was involved in, all the way to what looks like a criminal enterprise now. And you can begin to come up with all sorts of violations of federal crimes that have apparently been taking place. And so last night, an opportunity to hear from Tony Bobulinski and to, in a sense, identify that as you look at these emails, the person identified as the big guy is Joe Biden. The person who is identified as the chairman in one place, actually one place the chairman I think is an individual in China, but the other chairman is, again, the vice president. That this was going on when the vice president was in office and continued on because of the desire to trade on the Biden name for years. And so at one point, even Tony Bobulinski says he came to Joe Biden's brother, Jim Biden, and said, how are you guys getting away with this? Aren't you concerned? And he said, well, he just sort of looked at me, laughed a little bit, and said, plausible deniability. The only thing that perhaps was most discouraging about this very extensive interview was I thought, I'm going to go out on Twitter and see what people are saying about it. And what you saw were a fair number of people that would be conservatives were saying something about it. But what would have, I'm sure, blown up on the Twitter universe and on Facebook and everything else did not. And yet again, all you have to say is imagine if somebody was able to show on an investigation that, say, the sons of Donald Trump were trading on the Trump name and making millions, if not billions of dollars from some of these incredible deals ranging from Ukraine to China. Last night we heard of a variety of other states and cities I'd never heard mentioned before. And that then was completely ignored by the press. Of course, you know that would not take place. And so this is an attempt, I am convinced, by the mainstream media to say there's nothing to see here. It's all Russian disinformation. It is not true. This man is lying. Or in most cases, they're not even saying that. They're just simply ignoring that, hoping that the various American voters will just turn a blind eye to it. But I am convinced, after hearing this, that there will be charges brought. If for no other reason, one of the individuals that sometimes sits in here as our engineer just the other day was saying, where did the money go? And that question came up last night, too. I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of money. And even if it's in an offshore account, this gets into some really important issues that I think need to be addressed. And I suspect if indeed Joe Biden is elected, will be addressed and maybe even used as a justification to eventually move him out of office and let Kamala Harris be the next president. But nevertheless, let's take some phone calls because some of you have some comments to make, so I'd love to hear them. We'll go to Georgia first, WAGP. Larry, what would you like to put on the table today?
Well, listening to your last segment, it appalls me a lot of times that people will say, well, they're going to vote for a third party, which most of the time is just a way to deposit your vote and not feel guilty about not voting. But because we know they're not going to get elected anyway. But when they all talk about, Mr. Pfeiffer talked about Trump, I know that God used Cyrus as the Persian emperor or king to deliver Israel, and he was a very wicked man, very wicked. And then we find Pilate, he gets a choice between two people, and he had the power to let one of them go. And he washed his hands of the matter, which allowed the crook to go and the righteous one to die on the cross.
Yeah. Well, good points. I need to take a break, and then when we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. But if you would like to join us, maybe you have some thoughts, maybe even if you had a chance last night to see the interview that was on Tucker Carlson of Tony Bobulinski, love to get your comments too. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A term being used by certain pollsters is the shy Trump voter. It designates voters who plan to vote for Donald Trump but aren't telling pollsters how they will vote. Some pollsters believe these voters exist, while other pollsters reject the idea. One writer for 538 said that the polling organization found little sign of shy Trump voters. Another report from the American Association for Public Opinion Research found no evidence of such voters. David Catron complains that this is the classic appeal to ignorance. In other words, it is the argument that the absence of proof is the proof of its absence. He explains that such voters are, by definition, hidden. They rarely answer calls or respond to texts, especially from numbers they don't recognize. Even if they do respond to a pollster, they are not likely to be forthcoming. One poll found that 20% of registered voters say they are uncomfortable revealing their preferred candidate. That percentage is much higher when you ask conservatives. A recent Cato Institute poll concluded that the reluctance of conservatives to share their political views has increased from 70% to 77% since 2017. Next week, we'll be able to judge how many of these shy Trump voters actually exist. They may be insignificant, or they may reverse the current predictions. What we do know is that they seem to be quite a number of them 4 years ago. North Carolina provides a good example. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a 7-point lead in the last week in October, but Donald Trump won the state by more than 3%. Polling the electorate is a difficult and complex process. The possibility of hidden voters makes the prediction of next week's election even more difficult than ever. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to take as many phone calls as we can, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention the first article here is about that interview last night with Tony Bobulinski that was on Tucker Carlson. Whether you had to see it or not, I think this 4-page summary is a very good summary, shows you some of the arguments and some of the evidence, which is quite frankly overwhelming. And as many people have said, if you presented this evidence before a jury, they would convict. And so I think this, whether it affects the election or defeat of Joe Biden, is a big issue. And so it is going to be one that will be pursued, no doubt, by the FBI. And I want to talk about that in a minute because one of our callers brings that up. In case we don't get a chance to get to some of the other articles, I thought I'd just mention that the second article is also something you might want to find, because if indeed Joe Biden is elected, they talk about 11 trillion reasons to fear Joe Biden's presidency, because they, in this particular piece of research that Nick Gillespie has put together, talks about how really, and I don't think people realize this, that the Biden-Harris campaign and the platform really proposes $11 trillion in new spending, $1.4 trillion to expand Obamacare, $2 trillion for his version of the Green New Deal, another $1 trillion to deal with Social Security and the supplemental security income, another $1.5 trillion on education, $3.3 trillion spending by the House and Senate. You got to recognize the federal budget this year was $7 trillion. It's usually $4 trillion, but we spent so much just in terms of the pandemic. We are putting an incredible amount of financial burden on our children and grandchildren, and I'm saddened about that beyond even expression. But let's take some phone calls. We'll head to Maine, WSEW. Steve, thank you for joining the conversation today.
Hi, Kerby.
Always seem to have problems with your phone there. Let's see if we can get it again. I'm going to put you on hold just for a second. Maybe we can make that one work better in a minute. So we'll go to Jerry in South Carolina. I think you want to talk about the whole issue of the whistleblower. That would be Tony Bobulinski and the Biden family. So, Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, like I was saying, it just surprises me how the especially the media and a lot of politicians are just turning a blind eye to, this corruption by the Bidens. I've been a law enforcement officer for over 23 years, and, when I can just tell when somebody's not telling the truth. And, by listening to this one of Biden's partners that was on last night, that was not one part that I thought he was being dishonest or lying.
And time again, he said, here's the information. It's available. Read it for yourself. Come to the same conclusions.
That just blows my mind because the evidence is right there.
It is.
And like I said, I spent a good part of my time as a criminal investigator, and just based on the evidence that he has is enough to file charges.
I would think so. And I don't believe that maybe right now the media is turning a blind eye. I just don't see how the FBI and the Justice Department do so. And if indeed he ends up in the presidency, I suspect that may be just used as a lever to move him out, because everybody that's on either side of the aisle, Republicans, Democrats, know something's not right with actually the mental capacity of Joe Biden. So whether it's dementia or whether it's corruption, I think his days, even if he's elected next Tuesday, are numbered. And that means we will have a President Kamala Harris, if indeed the Biden-Harris ticket is elected. Let's go to Steve again, see if we got a better line there, up there in Maine. Steve, thanks for joining us. Well, do have some problems with up there in Maine. So let's go on to California. Michelle, I think you wanted to join our conversation.
Hi, I'm calling.
Well, we're just having problems with the phone lines today. I guess that's just one of those things. Let me put you back on there again. Do I have you?
Yeah, can you hear me? This is Michelle from California.
Very good. We just had a problem there with the phones, and we're certainly glad you called in. So what would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, I've been a resident my whole life in California, and I've seen what the Democrats have done to California. We have the highest unemployment rate, the highest homelessness, 150,000 homeless in our state because of the Democratic Party. They're all about themselves. They don't care about the unborn. Kamala and Biden feel that it's perfectly fine to abort a 9-month-old baby. And not only that, I was a victim of domestic violence. I reached out to Kamala Harris when she was our attorney general. I called her. I sent her letters. I was in desperate need of her help. She completely ignored me. She has no concern for women's needs. She has no concern for the unborn. I'm voting for Trump because I have seen what Trump has done. I'm a small business owner. I'm all about results. He has dismantled ISIS. He cares about the unborn. He cares about everyone. We've had the highest employment rate, the highest economic growth. What else do we need to show that this president is the one for the United States?
Well, we will see. Again, that's what a lot of people have been saying, and including his campaign and a variety of others, and saying, look at all the accomplishments. And, of course, the negatives have been, of course, the race issue and the pandemic. But, Michelle, I appreciate you sharing that. We'll try one more time. Steve in Maine, I think we got you this time.
Hi, how you doing, Kerby?
Very good. Thank you for your patience and tenacity. Go for it.
So, yeah, I mean, as I was saying, I think it's not surprising. Unfortunately, it's sad that it's not getting the coverage in the media, but it also, from what I understand, was basically dropped like a hot potato by the FBI and the DOJ.
That's another point. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. Go ahead, because they've had access to that hard drive since 2019, I think I've heard.
Well, and I'm not surprised because, they are an untrustworthy bunch now. The FBI, the CIA, they were loaded up, by the way, when Obama left office. He did an awful lot of work. He was very busy in the end of his term. Last term, and just doing bad things, and that needs to be looked at. An awful lot needs to be looked at. Unfortunately, that's been infiltrated, and they can't be trusted anymore.
Well, appreciate that addition there as well. And since we're coming to a break, and I don't want to take any more phone calls, let me just put those on hold for a minute. But we will come back and in just a minute talk with Debbie Wuthnow about iVoterGuide. And if you've got some questions about how to use the guide or about the election, we'll still keep it as an open line. But I thought just before we take a break, one of the arguments I make is that you shouldn't necessarily trust the media. You need to check it out. And even things we say, you need to check it out. And a perfect example of that came the other day for John MacArthur and his church, Grace Community Church. It is a perfect illustration of how if you've got a vendetta against in this case, church, you will do everything to skew the facts. Now, what am I talking about? Last Thursday, the Los Angeles Times, the headline, okay, I'm going to read you the headline. Coronavirus outbreak strikes L.A. megachurch that defied public health orders. Okay, so we are talking about a coronavirus outbreak. So you would say, all right, there must be hundreds of people at Grace Community Church that have COVID-19. And you would be wrong. Turns out they have 3 very mild cases that tested positive out of 7,000 people. 3 out of 7,000 is an outbreak and a blaring headline. And if nothing else, it just illustrates again that because John MacArthur has said, we're going to meet and we are going to do what we can. And if people want to wear masks and they don't want to wear masks and all the rest. But nevertheless, it is just amazing to me. Probably the best illustration I found recently on the pandemic. 3 mild positive cases out of 7,000 attendees at Grace Community Church. I don't think necessarily really even deserved a story, certainly not a blaring headline, and all the more reason for us to say, check it out. First of all, read beyond the headlines and check and see whether or not there may be some other stories that come to slightly different conclusions. When it comes to this issue of Tono Bobulinski, I'm sad to say that if you type in his name right now in a Google search, you'll find it on Town Hall, you'll find it in Fox News, you'll find it a few other places, but it seems to be completely ignored by the so-called mainstream media. That should tell you a lot right there. Anyway, let's take a break. We're going to talk about voting and the iVoterGuide. That's coming up right after this.
(2020). It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Last half hour, we're going to spend some time talking about the iVoterGuide, something we've been promoting, and now it is complete for all 50 states, and I thought that would be a reason enough to get on this program, the conversation about it. But there are all sorts of other resources. Now, I recognize that many of you may have already voted in my own precinct. I'm precinct chairman. I know that 60% of the people in my precinct have already voted. Got that. And you may have already voted. So don't think that this does not apply to you, because this can be something you can pass on to friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members that have not voted. And so there is a great set of resources there. By that as well, there's also information that might be helpful to you if somebody's not thinking about voting, because they have a great section here, Does One Vote Matter? A matter of fact, I got a commentary coming out on Monday in which I give my examples, but they use different examples there, so you can pull the two together and just really, if nothing else, help people understand that it is important that they vote. For some of you that are pastors, you might say, well, what are my legal rights if Sunday I do encourage people to vote? What can or can I not do? Well, there is a wonderful iVoterGuide that was printed in conjunction with our good friends at First Liberty. By the way, Kelly Shackelford will be with us on Friday. That is there. So there are just a lot of resources that I hope you'll take advantage of. And so to really explain all of that, Debbie Wuthnow is with us. She is the president of iVoterGuide. She is an individual that holds a master's degree in computer science from Princeton University, was also a systems engineer for AT&T Bell Laboratories. She joined iVoterGuide back in about 2011, really as a data analyst, and has now become the president since 2018. And Debbie, this has been an incredible task, but you've been able to actually provide voter guides for everybody that is in the listening audience.
Thank you, Kerby, for having me on. And it has been a God adventure in creating this and educating voters nationwide in all 50 states.
Talk about how you do this. I'm familiar, but I know that a lot of our listeners maybe heard you talk about this way back, but don't know the extent to which you go and do an evaluation of these various candidates. And explain the process, because it is pretty time-consuming, isn't it?
It is time-consuming. And actually, we have about a couple dozen research staff, and they have spent about 17,000 hours this year researching candidates, and they start by getting all the candidates' websites and social media links and having those ready to look at. We've downloaded the campaign finance data from the Federal Election Commission, as well as about 21 states. And so we have the data on who they've given money to, who they've received money from. We have people that are looking for endorsements as they come out. And then our research team works with each candidate, giving them an opportunity to answer our candidate survey. So gathering all of this research into one place. And then we have volunteers that we vet and we train and give them all of this fabulous information and kind of guide them through looking at what each candidate says, what each candidate has done, and assigning them an evaluation. So iVoterGuide is really different from any voter guide you've seen in the past, not just because the data is very comprehensive, but it's that evaluation. In a way, we vet the candidates, and we rate them from very liberal to very conservative, and do that. We evaluated over 7,500 candidates this year, including 5,000 just in this general election. So, and it's not like the PDF you would normally have, think of in the past of, pass off this PDF and it's a voter guide. It's a website. So you go to iVoterGuide.com and you enter your address, your voting address, or your zip code, and you get your personalized ballot along with that evaluation of every candidate that we've researched. But all the data is there for you to trust iVoterGuide, because we're really trying to give you a good tool but it's based on the data, and you can verify that for yourself.
And of course, if you want to focus on the presidential election, which I just clicked to just for the fun of it, you can say, okay, well, you say, I'll just pick one, Mike Pence, very conservative. Okay, well, how did you come to that? Well, then you hit the button More, and then it begins to give you all the organizations that have supported him, the reaction from the liberal organizations, what they've said about him, the various endorsements. Then it gives a list of the actual contributions. You can actually see what some of these big donors, who they are, what they've done, how they answered questionnaires if they did, or other things that might be available from their own experience. And so then you provide that for certainly not only individuals like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but Joe Jorgensen, which is a libertarian candidate, and Donald Trump, Mike Pence, and we can go down the list. And so these are just incredible resources. And if you maybe even have a question about your assessment of those individuals, you just click that button More, and it takes you through just a wealth of information that is public record. But again, you've done the work for everybody. And again, this is why I think it has been such a long, tedious, and time-consuming task. And so I really want people to take advantage of that as well. The other thing I might mention is you have a section called Voting Information by State. So click on your state, and then that gives you some information. Most of it, of course, is already well known, when the last day to register is, when the election is, a number of other things. But again, those kinds of issues are important. Or if you wanted to know how to get an absentee ballot, which is pretty late for most of our listeners, all of that has been there as well. So it's just an incredible website for anybody that wants to take advantage of that. And if that's not enough, there's more. You have a whole section on vote by the issue, right to life, religious liberty, national defense, health care, the economy, border security. So in some respects, what's your issue, what's your zip code, what's your state, all of that is available in one place right there at iVoterGuide.com.
Yep, we spent a lot of time on it, and I love that the vote by issue, what we've done is compared what the party platforms say, because in the general election, sometimes the party platform can be more important sometimes than an individual candidate. So we've got quotes taken from the Republican Party platform and the Democratic Party platform, as well as what God says, some scriptural references on those issues, so that you can be informed on all of those issues.
Let me just open up the phones in case you have a question for Debbie, because I know we will only have her on for another few minutes. But if you maybe had a question about the guide, or where you can get it, or how you can pass it on, or anything that you might want to ask, feel free to call right now, 1-800-351-1212. And Debbie, I wanted to, before we take a break, talk about something else, because you have a whole section here, Does One Vote Matter? Now, over the years, I've collected some incredible cases where it was a tie vote. Can't get any closer than that. But I thought I'd pick out a few of yours, because they, again, just show you how important one vote is. We broadcast, for example, in the state of Kentucky, and you have an example there of an election for Kentucky House of Representatives. That was in the 13th district there in the House of Representatives, ended in a one-vote margin that in that case elected the Democrat challenger over the Republican incumbent. So there's one out of Kentucky. We also broadcast in Alaska. And in Alaska on that particular year, the margin for District 1 of the House of Representatives was a single vote after a recount and a state Supreme Court challenge. Then you've got some other examples from Idaho and Minnesota and all the rest. But for anybody that says, well, what does one vote matter? All you have to do is use some of the examples I've used of Penny Pullen and a variety of others who actually lost because people, in Penny's case, did not vote. In her church did not vote for her because they just were too busy. And so she lost a primary election. And then I have another one out of Ohio where an individual lost by one vote and found out that his son, who lives with them, and his other son that lives across the street did not vote for him, which probably made Thanksgiving dinner a little bit tense. But nevertheless, we have some great examples over the years of how close some of these votes have been. And if nothing else, if you find yourself talking to somebody who says, what difference does one vote make? Well, it's going to make a difference, because you and I, Debbie, live in Texas, and I've had Matt Shaheen on this program, and he won by 0.5%. I've had Jeff Leach on this program, and he won by 1.5%. And I also have had some people that have been sitting across me, like Matt Rinaldi, who lost by 1%. So I can see some of those that are really close. But let's take a break, and then if you have a question for Debbie, you can give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Some of you might have said, I've seen the voter guide, or I don't know much about it, and how can I use it? Those are all certainly fair game. And then once we've answered a few of those questions, we'll move on to some other topics. But again, I would encourage you to go to our website, and you will find all the information that you need right there. Or you can simply go to, of course, iVoterGuide.com, and you can find it as well. But let's take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We're getting very close to the election, and when we come back, also finish off with just a couple of other comments, because some things coming out of Pennsylvania we need to talk about, and that may actually determine who the next president is. So I'll talk about that after we finish with our conversation with Debbie, right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just, as a program note, mention that tomorrow we're going to do our Millennial Roundtable. Chelsea will be the host, and we'll have Jonathan Teague and Rachel Radis and David Fraga and Richard Lim and Liberty McCarter and a number of others. So it'll be our Millennial Roundtable tomorrow. And then Friday will be our weekend edition, and that is going to be with Dr. Merrill Matthews, Kelly Shackelford, who was there at the swearing in of Amy Coney Barrett. And I have some comments about her and what is coming out of Pennsylvania at the moment in just a minute. But let's take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll head to South Carolina. Kent, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kirby, and good afternoon to everyone. I always appreciate you taking calls here. I'm actually a member of the South Carolina American Solidarity Party, and our candidate for president is Brian Carroll. So I want to know about who all is included in this guide, and I heard you mentioning values. I heard the short part of the discussion with the young lady, and thank you very much as well for making the guide. But when it comes to values, there's only one party I know of that matches all my Christian values, and that's the American Solidarity Party. That doesn't get a whole lot of talk about it for some reason. So that's my question: is does it include parties like the American Solidarity Party and candidates like Brian Carroll out of California?
Yes, and I might just mention, I think another one that would certainly match your beliefs would be the Constitution Party. But sadly, Debbie, the only party that of my list, and I mentioned those earlier in the program, that actually has qualified in all 50 states is a Libertarian Party. And I do know that you have the Libertarian Party there, but some of the others like the Green Party, the Alliance Party, the Constitution Party, the American Solidarity Party, Kanye West's birthday party, and some of the others, they don't, and the Green Party, they don't all qualify for all 50 states. So I guess that's one of the reasons why you had to be more limited.
Well, true, and we actually set the bar at 40 states. So we looked at every presidential candidate that was on the ballot in 40 states. But when there's state-level races and state legislative and congressional races, we include every party in a contested race. So it was just for presidential that we set the bar, because otherwise it would have been dozens and dozens of candidates.
And Ken, I appreciate your comment, because I did talk about that earlier, and I imagine most people don't even know there's third-party candidates, but Joe Jorgensen is, of course, in your piece because the Libertarian Party has been the only one to be able to get in 50 states. But some of the others, and I mentioned earlier that it's been very difficult for even the Constitution Party, which has been around for some time, started originally by Howard Phillips. He has been on the program talking about how difficult it's been sometimes to get into some of those states, because so many of the laws really are so guaranteed to support only the Republican and Democratic Party, two-party system. And I've always felt, Debbie, maybe we could get to the point someday we would have a multi-party system. That would probably be a little bit better. We've seen what it looks like in Italy and Israel and things like that. But nevertheless, like you said, when you work your way down to some of these others, as I mentioned just before we brought you on, the third-party candidates in Georgia may actually push the Senate races into overtime, and we may not actually know who the senators will be from Georgia, especially in the special election, until January 5th. So it's kind of interesting. This is an unusual year in a lot of ways, isn't it?
It is completely. Yeah, there's quite a few candidates in that Georgia Senate race. And what is it, going to go to a runoff, we think, because of so many...
Nobody looks like they're going to get 50%. Now, maybe David Perdue does, and so the special election would be the only one. But we'll see. I mean, it's just something that you never would have guessed. But just before we go, let's talk about some of the other resources, because you have a link to some of these resources. Some of our pastors listening right now say, I probably need to say something about the election on Sunday. And you have a section that actually talks about your legal rights and what you can or cannot do in terms of speaking on this issue. You have information about social media. You have information about where to vote and a variety of other things. So this is just sort of one-stop shopping. And if nothing else, I want to thank you and Richard Ford and others that have made it possible for us to make it available to our listeners.
Well, thank you. And, you know, when you do something and you throw your heart into it, it's a ministry for us. It's encouraging to be used and for people to find it useful. And more people are finding the information that's in iVoterGuide and using it. And that's just really why we did it, was we want to equip Christians to be good stewards of their authority to vote. And our studies, and it's basically been shown that a lot of people don't vote because they don't know who to vote for. And it's pretty cumbersome to do that research. So iVoterGuide just does that one aspect of voting and researching and vetting the candidates, and then provide it to voters across the nation through partnering organizations and like-minded groups to give them the tool that they need to cast a wise ballot and be a good steward.
Well, again, thank you so very much for doing it, and thank you for once again joining us here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, for having me. It's always a pleasure.
We will take a break. Let me mention a couple of the articles we have posted. The first one, which I called the Biden-Bobulinski testimony. If you did not have a chance to see the interview that Tucker Carlson did with Tony Bobulinski, this gives you a pretty good summary of that and why many people are even more concerned about what could be corruption on the part of the Biden family, which shouldn't be news to anybody that's listened to this program before when we've talked about some of the other issues. The other articles are the cost of the Biden presidency and how that would affect tax issues, and then one on election-related unrest, some of the real concerns about what could happen even election night or the day after. And so those are all available to you at our website, pointofview.net. But I thought I'd mention one other, and that is the Pennsylvania County Board of Elections filed a motion to the Supreme Court asking and calling for, I guess asking to be too nice, calling for Justice Amy Coney Barrett to recuse herself in any election-related dispute the court will be weighing on right after the November 3rd election. We all hope that the election, one way or another, is a landslide, one way or the other, if for no other reason that we don't want to precipitate a constitutional crisis. But the argument is pretty weak, if you don't mind me saying, because they've argued that she should not participate in this legal battle because, after all, the president tweeted that he wants justices to stop mail-in ballot conflicts. Well, first of all, that doesn't necessarily mean that she believes that. And more importantly, I've begun to become really impatient with some of these calls for Supreme Court justices to recuse themselves because others that should have recused themselves never did. Justice Amy Coney Barrett is replacing a seat that was held by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who never recused herself from very important cases. Let's just take one, same-sex marriage. She had performed all sorts of same-sex civil unions that I understand that she did, and yet she did not recuse herself from that situation. Elena Kagan, who was the Solicitor General under Obama, did not recuse herself, and if those two liberals had, I don't think we would have then had a decision coming down that would declare that any law saying that marriage is between one man and one woman is unconstitutional. So there's a good example. Now, I will give credit to the fact that Elena Kagan, who is the Associate Justice on the Supreme Court, has recused herself, I think I counted up 28 times. That sounds like a lot, but over a 2-year period, there's probably 150 cases, but she didn't recuse herself from what I think was one of the most important. And on the other side, I can point out Clarence Thomas has recused himself from cases. I think the record for a non-Solicitor General went probably to Antonin Scalia. And so conservatives oftentimes do it, and I wouldn't be surprised if Amy Coney Barrett even goes along with that, but it only goes one direction, and that is this is trying to force her to not weigh in on an election dispute. Let's hope there isn't an election dispute, but if there is, I'm glad we have 9 members on the Supreme Court. Well, that's all we have for today. Tomorrow will be our Millennial Roundtable. Friday, of course, our weekend edition. Want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.